She never expected it to become a problem. When she first moved into the neighborhood, the small house next door seemed quiet, simple, and friendly. The lady who lived there, someone everyone described as kind and generous, always had a smile on her face. She welcomed people with warmth and seemed genuinely happy to help anyone who asked. At first, this generosity was charming. The main character remembered the first time they borrowed her electricity for something small. It's just to charge a phone because their own outlet wasn't working. She'd waved it off with a laugh, saying it was no trouble at all. "It's nothing," she had said. "You can use it anytime." It was easy to believe her. Her smile seemed honest, and the way she opened her door without hesitation made it feel like she genuinely didn't mind. Over the next few weeks, the main character saw her doing the same thing for everyone. Kids from the neighborhood came over after school to charge their scooters or tablets. Adults borrowed tools or charged work devices. No one ever asked for permission formally. The lady just allowed it. At first, it was sweet. The neighborhood felt friendly. Everyone seemed connected by this small act of kindness. But slowly, the charm started to fade. What was once occasional became almost daily. People started assuming it was okay to plug in without even asking. Sometimes there would be 3 or 4 devices connected at the same time. The main character began to notice the electricity meter running faster than usual. Each month, the bills went a little higher, and each time they tried to mention it, it was shrugged off. "It's okay," she would say. "Don't worry about it. It's just a few extra units." At first, it was easy to accept, but over time, those few extra units started to add up. The main character didn't want to cause trouble. Confrontation wasn't their style. They had grown up believing that kindness should be met with kindness, and that if someone is generous, you shouldn't question it. But when the requests never stopped, the situation started to feel different. It didn't feel like kindness anymore. It felt like an expectation. People stopped asking politely and just assumed they could plug in. They would walk in and say things like, "I just need to charge this quickly," then leave it connected for hours. It wasn't just the small things anymore. It became more noticeable when adults, not just kids, started showing up with devices. Laptops, tools, and other electronics would appear at her doorstep without warning. Sometimes they left multiple devices plugged in at once. She watched as people came and went, all relying on her generosity without thinking of the effort behind it. It wasn't just about electricity anymore. It was about respect. The main character realized that while the lady's heart was kind, some people were taking advantage of it. What made it worse was the way people reacted if she tried to explain boundaries. A few times, the main character had tried subtle hints. "Maybe don't leave it plugged in so long," or "I think the meter is running a lot these days." Each time, the response was polite but dismissive. "Oh, don't worry about it," was the usual reply. They would smile, act like it wasn't a problem, and then continue as usual. It made the main character feel invisible. Their words didn't matter, and it seemed like no one even considered that there might be limits to generosity at first. The main character told themselves it was okay. Everyone needs help sometimes, and maybe this was just a passing phase. But the requests never stopped. Some days it felt like the whole neighborhood was using the house next door as a free charging station. Kids would bring over multiple scooters, plug them in for hours, and leave. Adults came by for work tools or phone charging. Some even came by late at night, apologizing for the hour, but expecting help anyway. It was overwhelming. The main character started keeping track of the electricity bills. Each month, they compared it to previous months and noticed a steady increase. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to make them uneasy. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle. The feeling that kindness had become something that could be exploited gnawed at them. They tried to imagine how to address it politely, but each idea seemed fraught with awkwardness. No one wanted to cause tension with a neighbor, especially not someone who had a reputation for being nice. But ignoring the situation wasn't working either. One morning, the main character decided to observe for a few hours without saying anything. People came and went. A group of kids plugged in their scooters, a man came to charge a power tool, and another person brought a laptop. None of them asked. None of them acknowledged that permission should be requested. It was as if the house next door had become a public utility. The main character realized that what started as generosity had unintentionally turned into exploitation. The lady next door still smiled, still offered help, but the constant requests were taking a toll. She looked tired more often. There was a faint worry in her eyes when she talked about bills or effort. It wasn't just about inconvenience. The main character began to notice subtle signs of stress. The lady had less time for herself. She was always busy helping someone. Her garden, once well kept, looked a little neglected. Her home, which had always been tidy, now seemed cluttered with cords and devices left plugged in. Even her friendly smile seemed to have a hint of fatigue behind it. The main character felt a mixture of frustration and sympathy. They understood why she kept helping everyone, but they also saw how it affected her life. The tipping point came when the main character had a day when they needed the outlet themselves. They had a personal project, something urgent, and found the socket already in use by multiple devices. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was impossible to do what they needed. They felt a flash of anger, not at the lady, but at the way people treated her generosity like an endless supply. It was unfair. It was disrespectful. And it made them realize that something had to change before it got worse. At that moment, the main character made a quiet decision. They didn't want to confront anyone angrily. That would have created tension and perhaps hurt feelings. They also didn't want the lady to feel embarrassed or ungrateful. Instead, they began thinking of a solution that would protect her generosity while also setting boundaries. They needed something that would make people aware that her help wasn't limitless. That kindness didn't mean permission to take advantage, but it had to be done carefully, without confrontation, without shame. The main character started researching ideas. They looked into simple ways to limit electricity usage without being intrusive. They considered timers, smart plugs, and other subtle methods that could give the lady control without making her feel like she was being strict or mean. Each idea seemed small, but effective, and each one gave the main character hope that there could be a solution. They wanted a way to teach a lesson without punishing anyone. It had to be a gentle reminder that respect matters. Meanwhile, the lady continued her routine, unaware that change was coming. She greeted neighbors with her usual warmth, offering help without hesitation. She didn't realize that some people had begun taking her kindness for granted. She still smiled through exhaustion, still welcomed requests, and still believed that helping others was always the right thing. The main character watched her and felt a mixture of admiration and concern. She deserved to be appreciated, not exploited. The days passed, and the requests kept coming. Some were small, some were more significant, but each one added to the sense of pressure. The main character stayed patient, continuing to think about the right way to handle the situation. They didn't want to cause drama, but they knew they couldn't stay passive forever. Kindness had limits, and boundaries had to be respected. The situation was delicate, but the main character was determined to find a solution that worked for everyone by the end of the week. The main character had a plan forming in their mind. It wasn't fully developed yet, but it felt right. They wanted a way for the lady to continue her generosity without being exploited. They wanted a way for people to learn a lesson about taking advantage of others. And they wanted a way to make sure her efforts were recognized and valued. The plan would need to be subtle, clever, effective, something that would make an impression without causing harm. For now, the main character waited. They observed, they noted, and they prepared. They watched how people came and went, how requests were made, and how the lady responded. They noticed patterns, repeated behaviors, and subtle changes in her demeanor. Each observation added to their understanding of the situation and helped them refine their plan. They knew that the moment to act was coming, and they wanted to be ready. Looking back, the main character realized that this had started as a simple inconvenience. A small favor, a few extra units of electricity, and a kind smile had turned into a complex problem. But they also realized that this was an opportunity to protect kindness, to teach respect, and to create boundaries without hurting feelings. It was a delicate balance, but they were determined to find it. The lady continued her daily life, unaware that the quiet observer next door was planning something that would change the dynamic forever. She still smiled, still offered help, and still believed in the goodness of people. And in that ordinary routine, the seeds of an unforgettable lesson were being planted. The main character felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. They didn't want to upset anyone, but they knew that change was necessary. They wanted to protect the lady's generosity, preserve her kindness, and prevent her from being taken advantage of any longer. And so quietly they prepared. Knowing that the next chapter of this story would soon begin, a chapter that no one would forget, the days passed. The main character noticed something troubling. Even after subtle hints and casual conversations, people continued to come to the house next door without thinking twice. The lady still welcomed them with her usual warmth, but the main character could see if she was tired. There were moments when her smile faltered just slightly, when her movements seemed slower, and when she seemed almost distracted. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, but it was there. The kindness she gave so freely was starting to take its toll. It was clear that some people didn't notice how much effort it took for her to keep helping everyone. They didn't see the time she spent untangling cords, rearranging devices, and making sure everything worked safely. They didn't notice the small sacrifices she made so that others could benefit. Some of them didn't even notice the looks of fatigue in her eyes. It was as if her generosity had become invisible, a service that could be used without gratitude or acknowledgement. The main character felt a growing frustration. They had tried subtle hints, gentle suggestions, and even casual conversations about how the meter had been running faster. Each time, the response was polite but dismissive. People would smile, nod, and then continue, as if nothing had changed. The subtlety that worked before had stopped working. The main character realized that kindness alone would not solve the problem. Some people needed a clear boundary, a lesson that free help could not be taken for granted. One morning, the main character witnessed an incident that crystallized the situation. A group of teenagers came over, laughing and chatting, carrying several devices to plug in. They were loud and oblivious to the effort required to accommodate them. One of them even leaned casually against the lady's wall while their device charged, spilling a drink nearby, but not paying attention to the potential mess. The lady moved quickly to protect her home, but her movements were slower than usual, and she looked exhausted. The main character felt a sharp pang of anger, not at the teenagers themselves, but at the way people's entitlement had grown over time. The main character knew that confrontation was risky. If they spoke harshly, it could create tension with neighbors or make the lady feel embarrassed. But doing nothing wasn't an option either. She deserved to be appreciated, and others needed to understand that kindness didn't mean permission to take advantage. It was a delicate balance. How could they protect her generosity without creating conflict? How could they teach respect without shaming anyone? As they pondered, they began to notice patterns. People came at predictable times, after school, during lunch breaks, and in the evenings. Some would stay for long periods. Others would come briefly, but all acted as if the service was theirs to take freely. The main character started jotting mental notes: who came, when, and what they used. It wasn't about spying or being nosy. It was about understanding the problem before acting. They wanted a solution that would be fair, effective, and subtle. Meanwhile, the lady continued her routine. She still welcomed visitors, still smiled, and still offered help without hesitation. She genuinely believed she was doing the right thing, and she didn't want to refuse anyone. She saw the small inconveniences as part of life and believed that kindness should always be met with gratitude. But the main character could see how this belief was being taken advantage of. The lady's generosity was becoming a tool for others' convenience. It's not a gift freely given. The main character began to think about ways to address the problem without confrontation. They researched small solutions, smart plugs, and other subtle devices that could limit usage without being obvious. The idea wasn't to punish anyone, but to gently enforce boundaries. The main character wanted people to understand that the lady's help was valuable and that it wasn't unlimited. They wanted a solution that would teach respect in a way that felt natural rather than forced. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern continued. The main character observed quietly, learning more about who was taking advantage and when. They noticed small signs of disrespect. People leaving devices plugged in longer than necessary. ignoring instructions, or showing impatience if they had to wait. Each instance added to the growing realization that change was necessary. It wasn't about stopping kindness. It was about protecting it. During this time, the main character also saw moments of genuine gratitude. Occasionally, someone would arrive, smile, and say, "Thank you. I really appreciate it." The lady would smile back, genuinely touched. Those moments reminded the main character why it was important to act carefully. They didn't want to turn the situation into punishment or resentment. They wanted to preserve the good feelings, the sense of community, and the appreciation that should accompany generosity. One afternoon, the main character decided to test a small boundary. They suggested that certain devices might be better charged at home rather than at the lady's house, phrasing it gently as a tip rather than a rule. The response was interesting. Some people ignored it completely. Others smiled and nodded, but continued as before. A few seemed mildly annoyed, as if they had expected free access regardless of advice. The main character realized that subtlety alone wasn't enough. Some people needed a stronger, more tangible reminder. The main character felt a mix of frustration and determination. They didn't want to create conflict, but they also couldn't allow the pattern to continue unchecked. They knew that kindness without boundaries could be exploited endlessly. They needed a solution that would make an impression, one that would be respected without causing resentment. And they wanted the lady to feel empowered rather than burdened. That evening, they sat quietly, reflecting on the situation. The lady had gone to bed tired but content, still smiling despite the exhaustion. The main character admired her resilience and generosity. She deserved to be treated with respect, and her efforts deserved acknowledgement. But the reality was clear. People's entitlement had grown, and it was time to find a way to restore balance. They began to sketch ideas. How could they subtly enforce boundaries without being obvious? How could they make people realize that her kindness was not unlimited? They considered simple mechanisms, timed outlets, usage alerts, or small devices that could regulate electricity flow. Each idea had potential, but the goal was always the same: teach respect without causing embarrassment. The next few days were spent observing more carefully. They noticed who ignored hints, who showed impatience, and who acted as if the lady's generosity was a given. Patterns emerged. Certain individuals consistently left devices plugged in too long, or came at times that were inconvenient. Others were respectful but lacked awareness of the effort involved. Each observation informed the plan, helping the main character decide how to act in a way that was fair and effective. During this period, the main character also reflected on human nature. They understood why people might take advantage of kindness. It wasn't necessarily malice. It was habit, convenience, and sometimes thoughtlessness. But habit could be changed, and thoughtlessness could be corrected. The key was gentle enforcement, a lesson that was visible yet non-confrontational. They wanted people to learn that generosity has limits, and that respect must accompany kindness. One afternoon, a small incident pushed things closer to a tipping point. A teenager arrived with several devices, plugged them in, and left without a word. The lady hurried to organize them, her movements slower than usual, her energy clearly depleted. The main character could see the subtle frustration building. They realized that passive observation alone wasn't enough. Action was needed, but it had to be thoughtful, subtle, and effective. They began to research quietly, looking for a solution that would achieve all three goals. They considered the impact on the lady, the effect on those taking advantage, and the long-term lesson. Each idea was weighed carefully. They wanted something that would not feel like punishment, but would create awareness. The main character wanted a solution that was clever, discreet, and effective, a way to protect generosity while teaching respect. The main character also thought about timing. It couldn't be sudden or harsh. The lesson needed to be gradual enough that people noticed and understood, yet clear enough that they couldn't ignore it. They planned small steps, starting with subtle adjustments, then increasing as needed until the behavior changed. It was a careful balancing act, a mix of strategy, observation, and empathy. Meanwhile, the lady continued her routine, unaware of the plan forming next door. She still greeted neighbors warmly, still welcomed devices, and still smiled through exhaustion. She believed in the goodness of people and the power of kindness. But the main character could see the toll it was taking. They knew that unless boundaries were established, her generosity would continue to be exploited, and her energy would continue to be drained. By the end of the week, the main character had a clear strategy forming. It was subtle, clever, and focused on teaching respect rather than punishing anyone. It would allow the lady to continue her generosity, but in a way that was sustainable and respected. They felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness. The next steps would change the dynamic forever. They believed it was necessary. They spent the evening thinking through every detail. How would people react? How would the lady respond? Could they ensure the lesson was learned without causing resentment? Each question was considered carefully. They knew the outcome would depend on patience, subtlety, and timing, but the main character felt ready. They had observed, analyzed, and planned. The moment to act was approaching, and they wanted to make it effective, fair, and memorable. As the night grew quiet, the main character reflected on the importance of boundaries. Generosity without limits could be dangerous, and kindness without respect could be exhausting. They knew that a small, clever intervention could restore balance, protect the lady's energy, and teach people a valuable lesson. They felt a sense of purpose, knowing that their actions would preserve kindness while correcting entitlement. The week ended with a sense of calm anticipation. The main character watched quietly, ready to act when the time was right.
The lady,
still smiling and welcoming, remained unaware of the changes about to come. And in that quiet preparation, the main character felt confident that the next chapter would finally bring balance, respect, and understanding, a chapter no one involved would ever forget. The main character had spent days thinking, observing, and planning. They had watched patterns, noted behaviors, and considered every possible outcome. The lady next door still went about her routine with her usual kindness, unaware that change was quietly taking shape. People continued to come as they always had, expecting help and assuming generosity would never end. But the main character was ready to act, carefully and subtly, without confrontation, without shaming anyone, and without disrupting the sense of community. It started with small adjustments. The main character chose tools that would gently enforce boundaries without being obvious. Simple devices, timers, and subtle changes to how the electricity worked were enough to begin the shift. The idea wasn't to punish anyone, it was to create awareness. People needed to notice that the generosity they had taken for granted was not unlimited. The main character worked quietly, making small installations late at night when no one would notice. The first step was subtle. A timer was placed on a single outlet, one that was most frequently used. The timer wasn't flashy, and it didn't make noise. It simply limited the amount of time a device could be plugged in. For someone using it briefly, nothing changed. For those who left devices plugged in for hours, the effect was immediate and noticeable. The main character didn't announce it. They waited, observing carefully to see the reaction. It wasn't long before the first few people noticed. A teenager came to plug in a phone, expecting it to charge quickly, and found that it stopped after a short time. Confused, they tried, adjusting it, checking cables, and moving the device around, but the timer prevented further charging. They looked at the lady, expecting an explanation, but she had no idea what had happened. She had gone inside for a few minutes, unaware that a subtle change had been made. The main character watched from a distance, noting the teenager's confusion and growing realization. Other people began to experience similar interruptions. Some thought it was a technical problem. Others wondered if the device was broken. A few were slightly annoyed, but the main character noticed that none of them immediately blamed the lady. The cleverness of the setup meant that she remained unaware, was protected from confrontation, and could continue her routine without feeling responsible for these small disruptions. The lesson was beginning quietly, without drama, and it was effective. The main character continued to make subtle changes, one outlet at a time. Each installation was designed to teach respect and awareness. For people who had ignored previous hints, these small disruptions were an eye-opener. They started to notice. that generosity was not limitless, and that their actions had consequences. No one was hurt, no one was embarrassed, no one's day was ruined, but awareness began to grow. Meanwhile, the lady continued her daily routine, smiling, welcoming visitors, and helping whenever she could. She remained unaware that the main character had begun to intervene subtly. Her energy was still strained, but she didn't know that the quiet changes were designed to protect her. The main character felt a sense of satisfaction in keeping her safe, in allowing her kindness to continue without being taken for granted. The small interventions were working exactly as intended. It wasn't immediate. But slowly people started to change their behavior. They began unplugging devices after shorter periods, paying closer attention to how much they used, and showing more respect for the lady's time and resources. The main character noticed these changes with quiet satisfaction. It wasn't about control, it was about restoring balance. People were learning that generosity required responsibility, and that respect was part of any act of kindness. One day, a neighbor arrived with multiple devices and tried to plug them in as usual. The outlets stopped charging after a short while, and the person looked confused. They checked the cords, the devices, and the sockets, but nothing seemed wrong. The main character watched discreetly and noticed the subtle moment of realization. They understood that they could no longer assume free access. It was a small moment, but it marked the start of a bigger shift. People were beginning to pay attention. The main character had planned the changes carefully. Each step was gradual, ensuring that no one felt punished, no one felt shamed, and no one blamed the lady. She continued to be helpful, still unaware that the adjustments were in place. The subtlety of the installations meant that people learned respect without confrontation. The main character realized that the key to success was patience, observation, and clever planning. They didn't rush the process. They allowed it to unfold naturally. Letting people discover the lessons themselves, as the days went by, small conversations began to change. People started asking politely before plugging in devices. They waited for permission instead of assuming it. Some even asked if it was okay to leave devices for a longer period. The main character noticed the subtle shift in tone, in body language, and in attitude. Respect was slowly returning, and the lady's exhaustion began to ease slightly. For the first time in weeks, she had a sense of relief, though she didn't know why. The main character reflected on the process and felt a quiet satisfaction. The lesson was working without being obvious. People were learning respect, and the lady's energy was being preserved. The interventions were small but effective, and each one reinforced the idea that kindness should never be taken for granted. It wasn't about control, it was about teaching awareness. One afternoon, a situation tested the plan. A group of teenagers arrived, carrying multiple devices, expecting to use the outlets freely. They plugged in, and the timers worked as intended. The devices stopped charging after a set time, and the teenagers began to notice the pattern. Confused, they checked the cords, the devices, and even asked the lady for help. She smiled politely, saying she didn't know what had happened. The main character watched from a distance, seeing the subtle frustration give way to realization. The lesson was taking hold. Other neighbors began to comment quietly among themselves. "Have you noticed the outlets stop charging after a while?" one asked another. "Yes," the other replied. "I think it's some kind of timer." People began to adjust their behavior, unplugging devices sooner, asking for permission, and showing more consideration. The main characters saw the results of careful planning and subtle enforcement. Respect was returning. The lady's generosity could continue without being exploited. The main character also observed changes in the lady herself. She seemed lighter, less tired, and more relaxed. Her garden looked a little better, her home a little tidier, and her smile more genuine. The subtle interventions were protecting her without her even knowing. It was a quiet victory. The main character felt proud, not because of cleverness, but because they had preserved kindness and restored balance. People continued to adjust. They learned the limits, they respected the boundaries, and they showed gratitude. The main character noticed that the atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted slightly. There was less expectation, less entitlement, and more awareness. Small gestures of politeness began to appear. A neighbor would say, "Thank you for letting me charge this," or "I'll unplug it soon." It was a subtle but powerful change. One evening, the main character reflected on the process. They realized that patience, subtlety, and observation had been key. They hadn't confronted anyone, embarrassed anyone, or caused conflict. Instead, they had quietly restored respect, protected generosity, and preserved kindness. The lesson was clear. Boundaries were essential, and respect was part of every act of generosity. The lady remained unaware of the full extent of the changes. She continued to smile, to welcome neighbors, and to help wherever she could. Her energy was better preserved, and she had more time for herself. The main character felt a deep sense of satisfaction in knowing that she could continue her kindness without being exploited. It was a quiet victory, one that would have lasting effects. Over the next few days, the changes became more obvious. People adjusted naturally, respecting limits and showing appreciation. The main character noticed subtle shifts in behavior. People were calmer, more polite, and more aware of their actions. The neighborhood had begun to learn an important lesson about respect, kindness, and boundaries. The main character felt content knowing that the process had worked. The interventions were complete. But the lessons continued. People remembered the subtle disruptions and adjusted their behavior. The lady's generosity was no longer taken for granted. Respect had been restored, and kindness could continue in a sustainable way. The main character felt proud of the quiet, careful work that had made this possible. As the sun set one evening, the main character watched the neighborhood from a distance. The lady next door smiled and waved at someone passing by. The devices were plugged in carefully, and people were considerate in their actions. It was a small change, but a meaningful one. Respect had returned, kindness had been preserved, and the lesson had been learned without confrontation or embarrassment. The main character felt a sense of completion. Part of the challenge had been teaching awareness without creating conflict. That goal had been achieved. They had acted subtly, patiently, and thoughtfully, ensuring that everyone involved understood the importance of respect. The lady's generosity was now protected, her energy preserved, and her smile genuine once again. As night fell, the main character felt a quiet sense of anticipation for the next phase. The subtle interventions had worked, the lesson had been learned, and the atmosphere had shifted. But there was more to come, a deeper understanding, a final realization, and a lasting change that no one would forget. The story was far from over, but the groundwork had been laid carefully, patiently, and effectively. The main character knew that the next steps would solidify the lesson, ensuring that respect and kindness continued to coexist in harmony. People had learned the importance of boundaries, and the lady's generosity could flourish without being taken for granted. It was a quiet triumph, one that would be remembered not for drama or confrontation, but for cleverness, subtlety, and thoughtful action. And so, with the groundwork in place, the main character waited for the right moment to complete the process. The lesson had begun, respect had been restored, and the lady next door could continue her life with her energy intact and her kindness appreciated. The subtle interventions had worked perfectly, and the next phase promised to leave a lasting impression, a chapter that no one would forget. The main character had been watching quietly for weeks, observing how people reacted to the subtle changes. They had seen confusion, curiosity, and the first hints of realization. People were beginning to understand that the lady's generosity was not unlimited, that her help came with responsibility, and that respect was essential. But the main character knew this was only the beginning. The real moment of understanding, the moment that would make people truly grasp the lesson, was yet to come. It started one afternoon when a neighbor arrived with several devices, expecting to use the outlets freely. They plugged everything in, chatting casually, confident that the familiar routine would continue. But this time, the subtle timers and devices worked as intended. One device stopped charging after a short period, another flickered and required attention, and a third simply wouldn't work without adjustment. Confusion spread across their face. They looked at the lady, expecting her to explain or fix the problem, but she had no idea what had happened. She smiled politely, shrugged, said she didn't know what was wrong. The main character observed from a distance, quietly pleased. This was the moment when people would start to notice that things were different. It wasn't punishment. It was a gentle, unmistakable reminder that boundaries existed. The neighbor tried adjusting the devices, swapping cords and moving them around, but nothing worked as before. Frustration began to grow, not because anyone had been hurt, but because the expectation of free, unlimited access was no longer valid. Others began to notice the changes as well. A teenager came by the next day, plugging in a phone and expecting it to charge normally. The timer stopped it after a short while. The teenager tried several times, checking the cords and plugs, and finally gave up with a small sigh. They left, realizing that the old habits would no longer work. Small, subtle adjustments had begun to teach a powerful lesson. Generosity could not be exploited endlessly. The lady next door remained unaware of the full extent of the interventions. She continued her routine with a smile, welcoming neighbors and offering help whenever she could. Her energy had improved slightly, her movements were lighter, and she no longer seemed so burdened by the constant demands. The main character had successfully protected her without her knowing, allowing her kindness to continue without being drained by exploitation. It wasn't long before the pattern became more obvious. People started talking among themselves. "Have you noticed the outlets stop charging after a while?" one asked. "Yes, I think there's some kind of timer now," another replied. The main character observed these conversations with quiet satisfaction. People were beginning to understand that the generosity they had relied on was now paired with responsibility. They couldn't just take and assume it would always be available. Small adjustments continued to make a big difference. The main character had carefully planned which outlets to adjust, which devices to limit, and how to make the lessons clear without creating conflict. They weren't trying to control people. They were teaching awareness. Each small disruption became a subtle lesson in respect. People were learning that kindness could be preserved, but only if it was treated with care. One afternoon, main character noticed an interesting development. A neighbor, after experiencing repeated disruptions, approached the lady with a polite question. "Is it okay if I leave this plugged in for a while?" The lady, still unaware of the interventions, smiled and said, "Of course, but please don't forget to unplug it when you're done." The neighbor nodded, realizing that their actions had consequences and that respect was expected. This was exactly the change the main character had hoped for. The subtle lessons were working in unexpected ways. People began to adjust naturally. They unplugged devices sooner, waited for permission, and became more conscious of their behavior. Even those who had previously ignored hints were starting to change. The main character noticed small moments of realization, subtle shifts in attitude, and a growing sense of accountability. Respect was returning to the neighborhood. One person at a time, the lady herself seemed lighter, happier, and more relaxed. Her smile was genuine, her movements less tired, and her energy more consistent. She continued her acts of kindness, helping neighbors without feeling overwhelmed or exploited. The main character felt a quiet sense of satisfaction in seeing her regain balance and freedom. She could continue her generosity without being drained. And the lesson had been delivered without confrontation or embarrassment. It wasn't just about the devices or the outlets anymore. The lesson had spread to attitudes, behaviors, and small social interactions. People were learning to ask politely, to wait their turn, and to respect boundaries. The main character watched with quiet pride as the neighborhood shifted subtly but meaningfully. The balance between generosity and respect had been restored, and the lady's kindness could continue as Stanably. One day, the main character witnessed a small moment that summed up the entire effort. A neighbor approached the lady, holding a device, and said, "Would it be okay if I use this for a short while?" The lady smiled warmly, and the neighbor nodded gratefully. There was no assumption, no expectation, just a polite request and a thoughtful response. The main character watched, knowing that the lesson had taken hold. Respect and kindness were coexisting in harmony. The main character reflected on the process and realized how much patience, observation, and subtlety had been required. They hadn't needed to confront anyone, embarrass anyone, or create drama. Instead, they had quietly restored balance, preserved kindness, and taught an important lesson. The interventions were clever but unobtrusive, and the results were clear. People were more aware, more considerate, and more respectful. The neighborhood had changed for the better. As the days passed, the lady's energy continued to improve. She had more time for herself. Her home was tidier, and her smile was brighter. The subtle changes had protected her without her knowing. People who had previously taken advantage were now behaving differently. They were polite, considerate, and aware of the boundaries. The main character felt proud of the quiet work that had made this possible. Even small interactions had begun to change. People greeted each other politely, thanked the lady for her help, and made sure not to overstep. The main character noticed these small gestures and realized that the lesson had gone beyond outlets and devices. It had become a lesson in respect, accountability, and awareness. People were learning that kindness required consideration and that generosity had limits. The main character continued to observe quietly. Noting the subtle shifts in behavior, they saw people adjusting naturally, without confrontation, and the lady's energy improving steadily. The neighborhood atmosphere had changed, less entitlement, more gratitude, and a growing sense of respect. The interventions had worked exactly as intended. One afternoon, the main character noticed a particularly satisfying moment. A neighbor, after repeated attempts to use the outlets without thinking, approached the lady and said, "I'll make sure to unplug it when I'm done. Thank you for letting me use it." The lady smiled warmly, genuinely touched. The main character watched from a distance, knowing that the lesson had been learned. Respect was restored, and kindness could continue as USTA and a BLY. The subtle interventions continued to reinforce the lesson. People were learning to wait, to ask politely, and to respect boundaries. The main character noticed the changes in behavior and attitude, realizing that the quiet work had been effective. The lady's generosity was protected, her energy preserved, and the neighborhood atmosphere improved. Small acts of consideration and gratitude had begun to replace assumptions and entitlement. The lady continued her routine. Unaware of the full extent of the changes, she still greeted neighbors warmly, offered help when she could, and smiled through her day. Her energy was preserved, and she no longer felt drained by constant demands. The main character felt a sense of satisfaction in knowing that she could continue her kindness without being exploited. The subtle interventions had worked perfectly. People's behavior continued to change naturally. They asked for permission, unplugged devices when finished, and showed more consideration in small interactions. The main character observed these changes and realized that the lesson had been fully absorbed. Respect and kindness were coexisting, and the neighborhood atmosphere had improved. The lady's generosity could continue sustainably, and people had learned an important lesson about boundaries and responsibility. The main character reflected on the process and felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. Patience, subtlety, and observation had been key. They hadn't needed confrontation or drama. Instead, they had restored balance, preserved kindness, and taught a valuable lesson in respect. The interventions had been small but effective, and the results were clear. People were more aware, considerate, and respectful, and the lady's energy was preserved. As evening fell, the main character watched the neighborhood from a distance. The lady smiled, greeted neighbors warmly, and continued her routine with renewed energy. People were considerate, polite, and aware of the boundaries. The interventions had worked as intended, teaching a lesson without confrontation, embarrassment, or conflict. The neighborhood had changed subtly but meaningfully, and the balance between generosity and respect had been restored. The main character felt a sense of anticipation for the final phase. The groundwork had been laid carefully and thoughtfully. People had begun to understand the importance of boundaries, and the lady's generosity had been protected. The subtle interventions had been successful, but there was still one last moment, the final realization, the culmination of the lesson, and a lasting change that would ensure respect and kindness continued together. And so, as night fell, the main character prepared quietly for the next step. The lesson had taken hold, respect had been restored, and the lady next door could continue her life with her energy intact and her generosity appreciated. The subtle interventions had worked perfectly. The next phase promised to leave a lasting impression, a chapter no one involved would forget.